Hey guys, Timothy here. I have been playing a ton of Shadows over Innistrad and I've been doing very well at it. 3-0 in most of my 8-man pods and 3-1 in or 4-0 in most of my F&M. So I figured I would share some of the tips that I've been using to really push my decks over the top in Shadows over Innistrad. It's such a fun format, and I know that a lot of people have not yet figured it out, and I'm not claiming to be a pro. I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not here to give you a pick list or anything like that. I'm just here to give you 10 tips, mostly for newer players or players who are struggling to do really well in this set. Tips you can use to really improve your game while you're drafting and playing Shadows over Innistrad. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love if you like, comment, and subscribe by the end. And if you have any tips that you would like to add or anything that's been working out very well for you, please leave it in the comments so I can read it, because I also like feedback. I also love when people point things out to me that maybe I didn't think about. But anyway, let's jump right into this. The very first tip I have for you here is that Shadows over Innistrad is a synergy-based format. It shares a lot in common with Battle for Zendikar. So oftentimes just picking the most powerful card out of a pack and throwing them together is a little bit worse than picking cards that make each other better. A lot of times the correct pick out of a pack is the one that improves the quality of the cards you've already picked. So just to give you a couple of examples, let's look right here. Assume that I've already picked up an Olivia's Bloodsworn, a Stensia Masquerade, Indulgent Aristocrat. Obviously, I'm looking to play something like red-black vampires. And then I get past a pack that has both Geese's Bidden and Twins of Mara Estate. Now, in a nutshell, in a vacuum, I think Geese's Bidden is a much better card. I would love to have this in almost any black deck, and it would fit in this deck just fine. But I think the better card here would actually be the Twins, simply because it is a vampire creature, and it will improve the quality of some of my other cards. It synergizes with them, whereas Geese's Bidding will be a standalone card. Not to mention that if I have more cards to go, my Twins actually gets better with each additional vampire-based card I pull, whereas Geese's Bidden is probably not going to get better in this deck. So I think here the correct pick may be Twins. Geese's Bidding will still be a fine playable card that will probably go in the deck, will not get cut, but the correct pick may be the one that works better with the rest of the cards you already have. The same goes for Delirium or Madness or any keyword type ability. If you really need that keyword to work out, and in this case I'm talking mostly about Madness and Delirium, then you need to take enablers. You need to take cards that make it work very well. Again, suppose that I've started off my draft with some really key Delirium cards, some very strong cards like Obsessive Skinner, Soul Swallower, Kindly Stranger, cards that I absolutely want Delirium to get going so I can take full advantage of them. Well, in the next pack, I might get past a Byway Courier and a Wicker Witch in the same pack. Very clearly, Byway Courier is the stronger card here. Not only in stats, but its ability just makes it so much better than Wicker Witch. But Wicker Witch works much better in a Delirium-based deck on account of it being an artifact and a creature. I might actually be tempted to take the Wicker Witch and put it in my Delirium deck than just to have another solid green creature. Byway Courier, again, is the stronger card, but it may not be the right card for the deck. And another example, just to throw it out there, suppose I have these equipment-based white cards that really need an equipment in my deck, and then I get past probably one of the best white commons or white non-rares in the entire set, and a very solid equipment. Here, I might have to pass the solid removal spell in favor of this equipment, simply because having it in my deck makes these three cards much better. Angelic Purge will always be good. Angelic Purge is a very strong card, and I think it's better than True Faith Censor, but True Faith Censor is still a strong card on its own, and it improves the quality of at least 3 other cards in my deck, whereas Angelic Purge is a one-and-done type deal. So you get the point here. Draft cards that make the rest of the cards you've already picked better. Now, moving on to that, the second tip I have here is to draft the payoff cards before you draft before you go drafting all the enabler cards. And what I mean is that these strategies, especially things like the tribal synergies or the keyword synergies like Delirium and Madness, or even certain types of decks like blue-red spells, they require a mix of both payoff cards, the cards that you're going to win with, and enablers, the cards that really get the engine going. So here we have a good number of examples as well. Looking at werewolves, you get some very, very powerful green enchantments and instants with Howlpack Resurgence and Moonlight Hunt, and perhaps those cards in a nutshell are better than the creatures that you're going to use them with, like Quilled Wolf and Convicted Killer, but my advice is to avoid picking the cards on the right before you have the critical mass of cards on the left that actually make them good. There's nothing wrong with taking an early Howlpack Resurgence or an early Moonlight Hunt, but suppose you do that and then you don't get past any good wolves, or you're really scrapping together kind of the base cards to make it work. Well, suddenly your Howlpack Resurgence or your Moonlight Hunt is a little bit worse than a card you could have taken in its place. So having the cards on the left here make the cards on the right much better, and that works vice versa as well. If I already have these cards, the ones on the left get better, but the difference is that these cards, Quilled Wolf and Convicted Killer, are fine on their own, whereas these cards need the cards on the left. So I would rather have the werewolves and wolves before I go taking the werewolf payoff cards. The same goes for strategies like Delirium, where I already want the Delirium cards before I go taking the Delirium enablers. Good example here is Shard of Broken Glass. Shard of Broken Glass, in my opinion, is an absolute garbage card, and I don't like it at all, but it does work particularly well in Delirium decks. The fact is, though, I'm never going to take Shard of Broken Glass unless I already have Delirium cards, and I suggest you don't either. The same goes for cards like Crow of Dark Titans, and yes, cards like this may be fine on their own, but they get so much better when I've already taken the cards that pay you off for using their abilities. Likewise, if you know for a fact you're going to be playing a deck like red-blue spells, you really need certain cards. That deck in particular requires certain cards like Pyre Hound and Rise from the Tides to really go over the top and make a win. If you see these cards, you should take them as early as possible. Don't expect them to always wheel, because a lot of times they won't, before you go taking all of the instants and sorceries that make the deck tick. Of course, again, Just the Win, Press for Answers, cards like Jace's Scrutiny or Burn spells, they're always going to be fine on their own, but if your game plan is to end the game with a spells deck, you are going to need the actual payoff cards to do that. These cards on the right will only do so much on your own. The cards on the left are the ones you need to win the game. And final note on this tip, I know it's a long one, there are a lot of cards in this set that are their own enablers and payoffs built into the same card, and these are some of the strongest cards that you can take early in the draft and build around. Mind Rack Demon, for instance, is a Delirium card that also mills. It feeds its own Delirium and kind of helps itself avoid the extra 4 damage. Thalia's Lieutenant pays you off for having a lot of humans, both by playing it early and playing it late. Very strong in a human deck. And Tireless Tracker is an engine in its own, creating an unstoppable creature while also generating card advantage over the course of a game. Very, very tight cards. These are only a couple examples. There are a lot of engines in Shadows over Innistrad, and they make for very, very strong first picks and build around type cards. Moving on to the next one, I am not a fan of saying a card is completely unplayable. There are cards I don't like. For instance, I said Shards of Broken Glass is not a great card, but it fits in certain decks. And I don't say unplayable because every single card has a place at some point. Every card has a little niche, however small it is, that makes it a little bit better than normal. But these 9 cards, I went through the entire set and I picked out all the cards that I would absolutely 100% never put in my deck, or for that matter, even sideboard them in. These are the 9 cards I suggest you absolutely do not play. Pieces of the Puzzle and Open the Armory are ones that I feel like I might get a lot of flack about, as well as Corrupted Graphstone and Stern Constable, which do fit in certain decks, but don't necessarily make those decks better in any regard. Pieces of the Puzzle can miss, and sometimes only hit you 1 instant or sorcery, really only fits in one type of deck, and just isn't really that good when you play it anyway, even if you do hit 2 spells that I would avoid playing it at all. Vessel of Volatility just doesn't do enough, even though it looks strong. It's not that powerful. Liliana's Indignation can miss as well and requires a lot of mana and a certain type of deck to really get going. Corrupted Graphstone is not what you want in a mana ramp card. Trust me, it's just not that powerful. Open the Armory does fit in decks that have a critical mass of equipment or auras, but I would rather just play a card that affects the board than another search option for one of those cards. Stern Constable is an awkward card that's kind of a madness enabler and also like a very aggro tapper, but I think it's so bad and it doesn't improve the quality of your deck that I would just cut it completely. Harness the Storm is virtually unplayable, very undesirable. You need to have at least 4, maybe 5 of a particular spell before it becomes good, not to mention lots of mana. Chaplain's Blessing is so low impact that it's not worth running, and Creep and Dread is a card that I would be surprised if it was actually good. I haven't actually played it at all, so maybe this opinion is a little out there, but I would avoid it. It's just a little clunky, doesn't do very much over the course of a full game, but I will admit to being wrong on that one if somebody can show me a good example. In addition, I've mentioned these 4 cards that I consider sideboard-only cards. These cards should not, under any circumstances, go in your main deck, but they are fine cards to pick up during the draft so that you have sideboard options. Root Out, in particular, is a very good sideboard option, both against equipment and some of the stronger auras and enchantments in this set. Invasive Surgery, I often won't even bring in against sorcery spells, but it is a sideboard option against people who are playing certain red-blue spell decks or something like that. Structural Distortion can take out equipment and also deals with Westvale Abbey. Clipwings also against decks with a small amount of flyers that aren't going wide with them. Maybe a big flying finisher like Westvale Abbey or something along those lines. Drog Skull Cavalry, Nephalia Moondrakes. Clipwings is a decent card against those. I would not mainboard these. Even a card like Root Out I don't think does enough in your main board to justify putting it there. 4th tip I have here, be prepared for the early game. I cannot stress this enough. The reason that I say green is the strongest color in the format, with red being very close, is mostly because of werewolves. The fact that you can play turn 2 Lambholt Pacifist and flip it on turn 3 if your opponent doesn't do anything gives you such an edge in the game that you're so far ahead of the opponent simply because your opponent didn't play anything on turn 2. You get punished very, very hard against decks like this if you do not have early game plays. So, in all honesty, this feels a lot like Origins Draft, Magic Origins Draft, where having turn 2 plays is very, very important, specifically creatures or ways to remove creatures. Cards like Deadweight, even something low impact like Explosive Apparatus or a cheap, maybe unexciting creature like Seagraph Scab may be the pick out of certain packs if you know that you need to fill that early game. Otherwise, you may just pack it into an early flipped werewolf or something along those lines. There are aggro decks as well, but in particular, the werewolf decks are the scariest ones to play when your curve is really high. I suggest making sure you draft at least a good number of cards, maybe 5 to 6 things that you can play on turn 2 or earlier. Don't get started on turn 3. You will lose a percentage of games that way to werewolf-type decks. Next tip I have for you here, and this is a very important one that only applies really to Shadows over Innistrad as compared to other previous sets, is to pay attention to the flip cards that are revealed at your table. In most formats, obviously, you don't have the extra information of these flip cards being revealed because there are no double-faced cards, but in Shadows over Innistrad, everybody at the table is required to show the rest of their table the card that they flip, and that gives you some very important information, especially when somebody next to you reveals a powerful, obviously pickable flip card. Now, I do want to preface this by saying I don't necessarily say that you should keep an eye on everybody's piles and see what flip cards everybody's taken, but pay attention to what's being opened and what's left in the packs when they come to you. Now, here's a good example. The player to your right, it's always the person next to you, not you, but the player to your right opens Archangel Avacyn, a card that they're almost 100% definitely taken and will almost definitely play. That means your opponent's going to be playing white, and is going to be passing in your direction first. Now, suppose that I opened Handwear, Militia Captain, and Forgotten Creation, two fine, nearly comparable rares. I would say that the Militia Captain is a stronger card here, in a stronger color, but Forgotten Creation is a passable, good rare that I would also be happy taking. Now, while if I did not know about this Avacyn at all, I would take the Militia Captain, I know that my opponent's very likely going to be in white, and I don't want a person passing to me, especially not that early in the draft, to be in the same colors as me. So I would actually pass the white card here, even though I think it's stronger, and move in on this blue rare. It doesn't feel good all the time, but you cannot get married to your first picks, and it's disastrous when you are sitting right next to a person drafting the same exact colors as you. Avacyn is the type of card that gives you a huge signal to stay away from white. The same goes with some other cards that maybe are a little bit weaker, but again, suppose that the person to your right opens up Gaia Reach Bandit, and you've seen that they've taken it. Maybe at an F&M, there's a very vocal person who lets you know, hey, I'm taking this Gaia Reach Bandit. Well, your opponent's probably looking to play something like red-green werewolves, if not red, and that should be your signal that red will probably be cut. It won't be very open in this draft. Now, suppose that's the pick that the person took, and you've opened these two cards, Wolf of Devil's Breach, and, you know, any comparable, not comparable, but any very strong uncommon, something like Nearheath Chaplain or Duskwatch Recruiter. In a vacuum, if I did not know about this bandit, I would take Wolf of Devil's Breach. It is an extremely powerful card, and it feels terrible to pass it. But I know my opponent to the right of me just took a red card. And if I take a red card, I'm going to be fighting with that person. While I think my better instinct would still take the Wolf of Devil's Breach, I would not fault somebody for passing it and taking the white card here instead. You're very much more likely to not be sharing a color with the person to your right. Again, the person who's passing to you. On that note, again, if you pass the Wolf of Devil's Breach, the person to your left is very, very likely going to take it. It's a huge sign that you're not in red, and then you can actually pit those people against you. The person to your left and right are very likely going to be fighting in red, where you can stay out of it and make your draft that much better. It feels bad, again, to pass certain cards, but certain signals from flip cards are very, very important to keep in mind. Moving on, we have this situation where people play 3-color decks and don't play any fixing, and it works out about 50% of the time, and it doesn't work out the other 50% of the time. Much like Battle for Zendikar, in fact, even worse than Battle for Zendikar, Shadows over Innistrad has terrible mana fixing. The only cards outside of green that fix your mana that you can play in any deck are Warped Landscape and Wildfield Scarecrow. Maybe I'm missing a card. If I missed a card, let me know. But I believe these are the only non-green cards that fix your mana in any color. In addition, there's a cycle of uncommon lands and a cycle of rare lands, but the rarity pushes those into the territory of not always accessible, and they're often cards that don't even wheel because people pick them up over worse uncommons or worse commons. So the mana fixing is awful outside of green. Now, on the flip side of that table, you have the green cards, which are actually decent at fixing your mana. I suggest, if you absolutely cannot stay out of 3 colors, if you feel like it's the best bet, maybe you want to splash some gold cards you've taken, make sure your primary color is green so that you can play cards like Fork in the Road or Weird and Wood and make it that much more likely that you'll have your splash color on time, or you'll be able to play your 3-color deck without too much trouble. You will, again, lose a percentage of games just by not hitting your 3rd color, and it feels terrible to not be able to play your cards, but consistency is often key in draft, and I suggest if you're not playing a heavy amount of fixers and you're not green, that you completely stay out of the 3rd color, even if that means taking a mediocre card mid-pick through a pack instead of a stronger 3rd color card, simply because you may not be able to force that 3rd color card into your deck. Moving on, I believe, and this is a personal opinion of mine, something I think a lot of people may disagree with, but a lot of people will agree with, is that auras in this set are better than they usually are. Of course, you have to watch out for the trick with auras. And the thing that really turns people away from auras is that if you kill the creature that the aura is attached to, your opponent gets a 2-for-1 out of you. Not only have they killed the creature, but they've also taken an additional card in that aura. Now, the thing is, that's still true for most of these, with the exception of Grifspoon, which everybody, I think, has realized is a very powerful card. But these enchantments, they really push your creatures over the edge. They give you a huge advantage in combat, and Shadows over Innistrad is the type of format where win in combat wins you the game. In addition, there are so many creatures with just high toughness and low power in this format that create a brick wall, with Watcher in the Web kind of being like the poster child of cards that are making the games last 20 minutes longer than they need to. And then these early game creatures that come out on turn 2 through 4 that just muck up the field and let your opponent kind of stall for a win. Enchantments can really push your creatures past these big blockers and win you the game. Now, cards like Equestrian Skill and Senseless Rage are not necessarily amazing cards. I'm not saying you should be first picking them or even picking them very early, because you can get them very late, but they are cards that push your creature past the point where you're going to be able to win most combats. And if you don't get 2-for-1, you can often carry those creatures to victory. Same with Ghostly Wings, which has a little bit of an added bonus, but just pumping your creature and giving it flying is enough to sometimes steal a game. Now, I would advocate for Hope Against Hope and Spiteful Motives being almost main deckable cards. In fact, I've played these cards multiple times, and they are very strong for auras, a lot stronger than most of them. I think Hope Against Hope is a card that people greatly underrate, but in a go-wide strategy, it can make one of your creatures absolutely ridiculously strong. Spiteful Motives will often win you combat if you play it at the right time and you don't play it into a trick on your opponent's side of the field, and it keeps attached to the creature, making it both a combat trick and a permanent pump spell. In addition, probably giving you the strongest creature on the field. One other thing to note before I move on from this tip is that a lot of the creatures in this format have very comparable power and toughness. You see a lot of things like 4/4s and 3/4s and 4/3s and 2/3s, and they're all around the same like 2 to 4 range. So given something +3/+3 or a huge bump off of Hope Against Hope, or even +3/0 in First Strike, even something as small as +2/+2 can be enough to give you the biggest creature on the field, which can give you the comfort of attacking and making sure that you're able to push in damage early and often. Sideboard out your cards, people. Sometimes when you finish a game, I'm sure everybody's heard this, you start sideboarding and your opponent starts shuffling their deck, and they say something along the lines of, oh, well, I don't really have anything to sideboard in, so they just start shuffling and they're ready for game 2. Well, one thing people forget is that sideboarding out cards that are bad in a matchup can be just as powerful as sideboarding in cards. Maybe you're removing a card from your deck and you're replacing it with something that's a little bit weaker, but maybe that card you're removing is so bad in the matchup that it's worth playing a weaker card in its place. Look at these 4 examples here. Gloom Widow, Gold Knight Castigator, Olivia's Bloodsworn, Howlpack Wolf. 3 of those 4 creatures cannot block under almost all circumstances. Situational circumstances, I should say, with Olivia's Bloodsworn never being able to block. And that can be extremely detrimental against a lot of decks. Again, I already warned against these red-green werewolf decks, or maybe like a black-red beatdown deck or something along those lines. If you're on the play and your first play is a creature that can't block and your opponent has already gotten started on their game plan, you're going to fall behind very quickly. Your creatures can still attack, sure, but if you're on the play, you're losing that race. The last thing you want is to just completely brick early and then have your saving grace be a creature that can't block. Gold Knight Castigator is another high-risk, high-reward type creature that I would not hesitate to take out of my deck against certain matchups. If my opponent's playing a lot of burn spells, if my opponent's playing a go-wide strategy that can just attack past my creatures, Gold Knight Castigator is not the card you want in your deck. Yes, it's powerful, but if it loses you the game, so what? One of the worst feelings in the world in a draft is to lose because of your own creatures, not necessarily because of what your opponent is doing. So learn when to board out certain creatures. My advice, these creatures that can't block, almost always take them out when you're on the draw, because you will be the one who's often defending against attacks rather than being the aggressor. When you're on the play, put them back in it and be the aggressor. That way you're winning the race. But on the draw, take them out. A couple more examples, and this is not an exhaustive list, of course. Humble the Brute is a card that is super, super sketchy because sometimes you play against a deck that doesn't really have any targets for it. Again, if you're playing against these werewolf decks or you're playing against something with a bunch of auras or equipment, Humble the Brute's going to be a fine card and it'll have targets. But if you're playing against kind of a small spirit deck or a small zombie deck, you may just hold this Humble the Brute in your hand and not be able to find a target for it, making it a very, very expensive, useless spell. Same with cards like Magmatic Chasm, which are already niche playable cards in very specific decks. But if you're up against a blue-white flyer deck or some other combination of colors that just has nothing, it seems, but flyers, board this card out. It's just not doing that much for you. And then the Faded Triskaidekaphobia. If you're playing against black-white and your goal is to play Triskaidekaphobia, please board the card out. If your opponent's able to ping you for small amounts of damage, or your opponent has a lot of lifelink in their deck, Triskaidekaphobia may not be the win condition you want in their deck. There's nothing more embarrassing than losing to your own Triskaidekaphobia. Trust me, been there. 2 more tips to go. This one being something I think is actually very, very important. Blue is a very weak color in this set. It's very similar to green in Battle for Zendikar, where I think most players have identified it as the worst color, and I agree with those players, simply on account that most of the commons, well, not most, but a very high portion of the commons just aren't exciting cards or behind what the other colors are doing, or need a lot of work to just kind of get them going. Not to mention some of the uncommons and rares are also quite unexciting as well compared to other colors. Blue is definitely the worst color in Shadows over Innistrad. I will go on record as saying that. But I'll also mention that out of all the Shadow over Innistrad drafts I've done, I've probably been in blue a good 80-90% of the time, and no, that's not an exaggeration. The reason is because blue is almost unanimously understood to be the worst color, which means you can often get rewarded for being in that color. Nobody else wants to play it. That means you get all the goodies that color has to offer. Very, very similar to green in Battle for Zendikar. In BFZ, if you were the only green player at the table, you often got rewarded with rares, key uncommon cards, and so on and so forth. You could actually make a serviceable, strong deck out of it. The same goes for blue here. Now, I like blue as a support color. It has bounce spells. It has a couple tempo plays. So I suggest not going all in on blue and trying to play monocolored. But look at the examples down here. These are cards that you can often get past while you're in blue, and you can often wheel these cards too. Maybe not the rares, but the uncommons often come back around, maybe second to last pick or last pick. You can make a very good mill deck with cards like Manic Scribe and Fleeting Memories. Welcome to the Fold is a rare that I've seen past so many times simply because people do not want to take first pick blue rares, or they'll take a quote-unquote better uncommon over it. Rise from the Tides is a card, a crucial card in the red-blue spells deck that you can often pick up because nobody else wants it at the table. And sometimes if you're in blue, you get rewarded with cards like Altered Ego or some other dual color gold blue card, simply because your opponents aren't able to play it, they're not able to splash, and they have no use for the card themselves. So while I would suggest, if you're going in and your question in Shadows over Innistrad is what's the best color, then I suggest not necessarily taking blue early or taking a better uncommon over a particularly medium blue rare. But keep in mind that the best way to draft almost every set is to draft what's open and let your deck build itself rather than force a color or force out a color. And in this case, you can be rewarded quite a bit for playing blue if you've identified that it's open and you've identified that not many people at the table are playing it. All right, final tip. Do not forget about the graveyards, and by that I mean both your opponent's graveyard and your own graveyard. Say, for instance, your opponent cracks a card like Vessel of Paramnesia and they target themselves to mill themselves for Delirium, and then they draw a card. A lot of times what I see is that when I do this type of play, my opponent doesn't even care what cards I put in the graveyard. Now, the top half here is a little bit less important than the bottom half, simply because most avid players, most players who have, it's not their first time drafting, they'll pay attention to what goes to the graveyard. Think about a card like Mad Prophet. Whenever you discard with it, you often say, I'm discarding blank, and then I draw a card. Some players don't do that. They simply throw a card from their hand into the graveyard, and then they draw another card, and they never announce it. Their opponent never looks at what card went to the graveyard, and maybe it's something relevant. Maybe it gives you more information that you can use for the next game. Similar with Startled Awake, or any mill card for that matter. If your goal is to mill your opponent, and you're using cards like Startled Awake or Fleet in Memory or Manic Scribe, pay attention to the cards that are going to the graveyard. Even if they don't have any graveyard utility, perhaps you mill a bomb or something that you wouldn't have otherwise seen, and you can sideboard accordingly in the next game. One mistake I often see from mill players, I see this a lot with Sphinx's tutelage decks, is that they'll mill their opponent out, they'll get their opponent to 0 cards, and then they'll immediately start the next game. If you know you're going to win, ask your opponent to look at their graveyard, get a good idea of what their deck looks like, and then win the game from there and have that information ready for the next game. On the flip side, don't forget about the cards in your own graveyard. I have seen way too many times people playing nasty combos like Sanitarium Skeleton and Call the Bloodline, and then around mid-game they forget that Sanitarium Skeleton's in their graveyard. My suggestion, and this is a huge suggestion that I suggest people do moving on, even outside of Shadows over Innistrad, is when your cards go to the graveyard, don't stack them up in a single pile. Lay them out a little bit apart from each other so you can see the name of every card in your graveyard. You see this a lot on camera footage for tournaments. I suggest doing that. It is a huge deal to know every single card that's in your graveyard at one time. This is a very heavy graveyard-based set, and being able to know that you have a Dauntless Cathar or a Geist Blast or a Sanitarium Skeleton, cards along those lines, are constant reminders that you have extra cards, essentially, that you can play. Please don't forget about your skeletons. They're in your deck for a reason. They're not busted 1-drops. Same with Dauntless Cathar. The 3/2 is fine, but you rarely like that extra ability, and Geist Blast copying a certain spell can really win you the game. If you forget about them, well, you don't expect your opponent to be the one to remind you. Now that's all I have here. I hope some of these tips have been, if not maybe useful for you, at least interesting. So again, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm very curious to hear what you think, not only about the tips I've offered, but about any tips that you may have to offer. Like I said, I've been doing very, very good in Shadows over Innistrad, and I am not even close to 100% figuring out the set. It is very complicated, it is very challenging, and it is exceptionally fun. I hope these tips can be of use to somebody, and I hope your tips can be of use to me. So again, thank you for watching. Be on the lookout for more videos soon. This is Timothy, and I will see you next time.